Felicia Hemons's story is all too common in the Romantic period and in the history of women writers in general. She married an unsuitable husband, had many children, and then had to write just to support her family. So the similarities to Charlotte Smith here should be noticeable. Hemons's husband was a naval captain who complained, quote, "It was the curse of having a literary wife that he could never get a pair of stockings mended." They separated after just over 5 years of marriage, with 4 children and a 5th on the way. So, like Charlotte Smith, Hemons was in a position where she had to write feverishly and for popular tastes in order to secure the necessary living for her family. Unlike Smith, she did not turn to novels. Living some 30 years later, there was somewhat more of a market for her poetry, but she was still under the pressure of needing to write what would sell. So again, we see the familiar problem that while male Romantic poets were largely men of leisure, and able to write what they wanted at whatever pace they wanted, one could hardly imagine Coleridge having to work to a deadline in the way that Hemons did. Hemons earned quite a solid reputation as a poet. She was fairly popular, although, as was the fate of many women at the time, she quickly fell into neglect after her death in 1835 at the age of 41 of tuberculosis, same disease that killed John Keats. Again, we see the familiar plight of women's writing being perceived as ephemeral, pleasing at the time, but not worthy of record in posterity, which is, to some degree, the subject of the poem as well, the relationship between women and fame. Joan of Arc in Rheims comes from a collection called Records of Women, all of which deal with historical women, which is suggestive of Hemons's concern with establishing and defining a sphere for women in contrast to the public masculine historical sphere. In terms of genre, the poem starts in heroic or epic mode, but quickly narrows its scope to something that looks more like a lyric. We move from the celebration of the coronation of Charles VII to a somewhat disjunctive portrait of Joan herself. That slight form, was that the leader through the battle storm? The description here focuses on her outward appearance, her apparent weakness, had the soft light in that adoring eye, also attributed a certain softness. And from there, we move to a domestic scene in which Joan embraces her father and her brothers, a brief return to the feminine domestic space before she will turn away from them forever. And finally, this leads to a kind of imaginative return to her childhood, which in a Wordsworthian way is referred to as a music heard and felt, winning her back to nature. With a potential double meaning here on the word nature, she recalls both the natural world in which she grew up and her female supposed nature as she returns to a domestic space as well as a natural one. So the poem implicitly sets in contrast a masculine value system based on fame and public action with a feminine value system based on domesticity and private virtues. For example, is there indeed such power far deeper dwells in one kind household voice to reach the cells whence happiness flows forth? Which suggests that despite her success, Joan would have been better to stay at home. One kind household voice is ascribed a greater value than the glory of her high career. Thus, the scene that Hemans chooses to focus on in this poem is deliberately one that removes Joan from the masculine world. She saw the pomp no more. So we see a deliberate transition here from the public world in which Joan has been operating. She's been leading the troops of the Dauphin, has led him to be crowned King of France, and is now shifting into a more private domestic mode. And here we might pause and compare Hemans's attitudes towards fame to those of her male contemporaries, such as Byron, who awoke one morning and found himself famous, or Keats, who was agonized by the thoughts of dying without creating at least one immortal work. Hemans, by contrast, is much more suspicious of the benefits of such fame, at least for women. The end suggests that fame can only be bought for women at the price of domestic happiness. And one of the important questions in this poem is whether the speaker seems to agree that fame is worth that price. If we start by looking at the epigraph, which comes from the poem Woman and Fame, which I've also asked you to look at, we can see the contrast here between two types of drink. The charmed cup of fame that seems to be magical and intoxicating, and the sweet waters from affection's spring, which is suggested to be appropriate to the speaker as a woman in particular. To me, a woman, bring sweet waters from affection's spring. So the intoxicating draught of fame is to be avoided, while the wholesome waters of domestic affection should be sought after by women. And the final lines of the poem seem to reinforce that point as well. Too much of fame had shed its radiance on thy peasant name, and bought alone by gifts beyond all price, the trusting heart's repose, the paradise of home with all its loves, doth fate allow the crown of glory unto woman's brow. In other words, glory is only possible at the price, at the sacrifice of the domestic virtues, the trusting heart's repose, and the paradise of home with all its loves. So, does the poem therefore suggest that pursuing masculine values is wrong for a woman, or does it suggest that the masculine values are themselves inherently wrong, and thus that women are superior when they remain within their proper sphere? Certainly, she seems to feel that domestic life is worth more than the public sphere. To some degree, she is adopting here the proper feminine attitude of the proper lady, not being covetous of public glory. She's also figuring herself in this poem to a certain degree. She'd become a really reasonably famous poet, but she felt that public glory did not compensate for her domestic unhappiness, although it also doesn't seem to have been the cause of it either. Although again, we might ask to what extent Hemans is adopting the pose of the proper lady, because this is what sells in the marketplace. Keep in mind that this poem comes from a collection called Records of Women. So she's placing importance on the stories of women, even as the moral she draws from them is that such stories are better off not having been created in the first place. So again, there's a certain ambivalence in Hemans's attitude here, in that she is both celebrating and effacing the records of women.